In this video, we're going to go over the body cavities. There's two goals in mind when we are talking about body cavities. The first one is something that you'll do more when we start stations. Will you be able to go up to the torso models we have in the classroom and point out where the body cavities and their subcavities would be? And what we'll cover in this video are the names and locations of the major body cavities, how they're broken into subdivisions, and then being able to list some of the major organs in each. We're not going to be going into all of the organs at this point, just some of the big organs that you should be familiar with. On your note sheet, you have these diagrams, and the first thing to know is that there are two basic body cavities, and they are named for the sides of the body that they're on. The first body cavity is the dorsal body cavity. Think back to the first video when we talked about directional terms. Dorsal was synonymous with posterior. So the dorsal body cavity is located along the posterior side of the body. In the video here, it's highlighted in yellow. So it goes along the back side of the body. And the ventral body cavity is located on the anterior side. And it's located on the anterior side because ventral was another name for anterior. Other ways to remember it, think dorsal, dorsal fin, and ventral, picture that you have to ventilate. This is your nose, and you breathe in, you ventilate on the anterior side of the body. Within the dorsal body cavity, there will be organs that belong to the nervous system. On your note sheet, it's broken into two subcavities, the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. The cranial cavity would contain the brain, so that would be the major organ housed by the cranial cavity. The vertebral cavity is going to be housing the spinal cord. In this picture on the right, the vertebral cavity just looks like it's going down to the chest, but when we look at the lateral view, it goes all the way down through the bottom of the spinal cord. The ventral body cavity has much more going on. One term that you'll see used for organs is viscera. So the ventral body cavity contains much more viscera than the dorsal body cavity. In order to keep things straight, they are going to further break the ventral body cavity into two subcavities, the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. But the ventral body cavity is all on the front. So let's talk first about the thoracic body cavity, that subcavity within the ventral body cavity. We know that thoracic was a regional term, and thoracic referred to the chest. The chest is superior on the torso, and we will use the diaphragm as the boundary between the thoracic body cavity and the abdominal pelvic body cavity. So right kind of where it's in between, where it's shaded that maroon color, would be the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is the boundary between the two ventral body cavities. So everything superior to the diaphragm would be a part of the thoracic body cavity. Within the thoracic body cavity, there are three subcavities again. And I've broken those down so it should be shaded gray for you on your note sheet. And it's written in that you have a pleural cavity. There's two of them because you have two lungs, so there would be a pleural cavity on the right side and a pleural cavity on the left side of the body. Within each pleural cavity is one lung, so that's your major organ within the pleural body cavity. The mediastinum is this little triangle between the superior portion of the lungs. The mediastinum is going to have what says remaining thoracic organs. This would include things like major blood vessels and parts of your respiratory and digestive systems, like parts of the esophagus and the trachea. The final subcavity within the thoracic cavity is the pericardial cavity. Cardial is going to refer to heart. So cardiac division is going to be having to do with the heart is the major cavity. The prefix peri, which we will see several times throughout the year, means surrounding. So thoracic body cavity has 3 subcavities. Pleural cavities, technically there's 2. Pleural refers to the lungs. The mediastinum, which is superior to the heart in between the lungs, and the pericardial cavity, which houses the heart. The other division of the ventral body cavity is the abdominal pelvic cavity. It's a smushed together word combining the region for the abdomen and the pelvis. So when we talked about regional terms, we said the abdominal region was like where you have your six-pack abs, the abdomen, and the pelvic region was having to do with your hips. So within the pelvis, we're going to say, is where the pelvic cavity is. Together they make up the abdominal pelvic cavity, but we can also subdivide them as well. So within the abdominal pelvic cavity, there's 2 subdivisions. The abdominal cavity, when you think about what is in your abdomen, digestive system organs should pop out at you. So things like the stomach and the intestines would be good examples of major organs to keep in the abdominal cavity. The pelvic cavity is inferior to this, and it sits between your hip bones. Those hip bones form protective pieces for organs like your bladder and your reproductive organs. This is what it would look like with the organs showing. So the diaphragm is here. Remember, the diaphragm is the boundary between the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic cavities. So up here we would have our thoracic body cavity, and we can see that there's 2 pleural cavities, one for each lung. Here's the heart, so that must be our pericardial cavity, and this little wedge between the lungs but above the heart would be the mediastinum, and it would have different things like the ends of the esophagus, the ends of the trachea. Inferior to the diaphragm, we have all of our digestive system organs, our urinary system organs, and what would be the reproductive organs as well down here. So we have the abdominal pelvic cavity below, the abdominal cavity with things like the stomach and the intestines, and the pelvic cavity would have pieces like the bladder. Alright, let's finish up by just going through this diagram. We have a lateral view of a torso numbered 1 through 5. Let's start by first identifying what the numbers are, so which specific subcavity is shown. Cavity 1 is up by the skull, and if we think of what was the regional term for skull, that was the cranial region. Number 1 is the cranial cavity. Number 2 runs along the back where the spinal cord would be. Think about what surrounds the spinal cord, and that's vertebrae. So number 2 is the vertebral cavity. So never mind this crazy writing. That's supposed to say vertebral cavity. This is a B. Number 3, let's just do the major subcavity, not the specific ones like the lungs. So number 3 is in which region? Let's think of that. And it would be in the thoracic region. So number 3, let's name as the thoracic. Or in the shaded region would be the diaphragm. So now we know we're going inferior to the diaphragm. Number 4 is in the region of the abdomen, so it's going to be the abdominal cavity. And number 5 is in that hip region, the pelvic region, so this is the pelvic cavity. Going back to the beginning of the video, the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity are both on the dorsal side of the body, so these are making up the dorsal body cavity. And 3, 4, and 5 are on the front side, or the ventral side of the body, so they make up the ventral body cavity. So those are your major body cavities and the subcavities within them, and you should also have examples now of major organs that go within each of the cavities.